$15,000. That was the price they thought would silence Jasmine Crockett. The announcement landed like a hammer blow in the chamber, a number chosen not only for its weight but for its symbolism. It wasn't a fine in the strictest sense. It was a warning, a message, a shot across the bow meant to remind her of her place. To the establishment, it was the cost of daring to speak with passion, of refusing to bow her head when confronted with arrogance. To Jasmine Crockett, it was proof that her voice had struck a nerve. The room itself seemed to hold its breath as the words echoed. 15,000. Some faces smirked with satisfaction, the quiet grin of those who believed order had been restored. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance of justice, wondering why truth was being taxed like a luxury good. In that moment, the divide was visible. Those who wield power as a weapon, and those who wield words as a shield. Crockett stood at the center of it all, the unwilling protagonist in a drama written by her opponents. But the irony was already brewing. They had cast her as the villain when, in truth, they had only elevated her as the hero. Her voice, strong and measured, had already become a rallying cry for those watching from afar. The fine was supposed to be a silencer. Instead, it was an amplifier. Imagine the ordinary viewer, scrolling through headlines late at night, stumbling upon the news. Representative fined $15,000. The initial reaction is shock. What could she have possibly done to warrant such a penalty? And then comes outrage, because the answer reveals itself quickly. She dared to speak truth to power in a room that often mistakes decorum for justice. $15,000 may seem like a sum, but in the court of public opinion, it's priceless evidence of a deeper struggle. This was never just about money. It was about dignity versus dominance, courage versus control. And as Crockett's eyes met those of her critics, one thought was already beginning to spread far beyond the chamber. They had made a catastrophic mistake, because what happened next left even her enemies stunned. The fine didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of weeks, even months, of fiery exchanges in committee hearings and late-night debates where Jasmine Crockett refused to be talked over. She had earned a reputation for sharp words delivered with sharper clarity, for cutting through layers of doublespeak with a precision that made even seasoned politicians squirm in their seats. And that reputation came with a price. In a chamber where women of color are often expected to wait their turn, she broke the unspoken rule. She refused to be silent. Every time Crockett spoke, she disrupted the choreography of power. She wasn't supposed to challenge the smug interruptions, the condescending smirks, the theatrics that so often play better on cable news than in the real lives of constituents. But she did, and the more she pushed back, the more the establishment grew restless. To them, her voice was not just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Dangerous because it resonated. Dangerous because it cut through noise with authenticity. Dangerous because people were listening. So the fine became their weapon of choice. A financial penalty disguised as discipline, meant to send a chilling message: if you raise your voice, we will raise the cost. But what they didn't account for was the broader stage on which this drama was playing out. Because Crockett wasn't just standing for herself. She was standing for every woman who's been told to calm down, every immigrant's child reminded of their place, every black voice dismissed as angry when all it spoke was truth. This is where the stakes rise beyond $15,000. Number is meaningless compared to the principle. It was never about the money, it was about who gets to be heard, who gets to define the boundaries of respectability, and who gets punished for crossing them. The establishment wanted Crockett's story to be one of chastening, of retreat, of quiet compliance. But to millions watching online, it instantly became something else. The story of a woman refusing to pay the toll for honesty. And here lies the power of the moment. Because when an institution tries to muzzle one voice, it often awakens thousands more. Social feeds buzzed, Messages poured in, hashtags erupted not because of the fine itself, but because of what it represented. It revealed the double standard so clearly that it could no longer be hidden. Other members of Congress had shouted, insulted, even lied with impunity. Yet no $15,000 price tag was attached to their behavior. Why now? Why her? The question didn't need an answer. The injustice was answer enough. For Crockett, the fine was proof that her words had landed exactly where they needed to. The louder the resistance to her presence, the clearer it became that she was changing the balance of the room. And though her opponents smiled with satisfaction as the penalty was declared, the irony was already in motion. Their attempt to reduce her to a footnote had instead written her into the headline. They thought it would end her voice. Instead, it only multiplied it to understand why a $15,000 fine was weaponized against Jasmine Crockett. You have to look closely at the people who engineered it, the self-appointed guardians of decorum, a faction that thrives on double standards and selective outrage. These were not neutral arbiters of justice. They were veterans of political theater who understood one truth all too well. If you cannot win the argument, you try to silence the opponent. For years, this bloc had cultivated an image of authority built on bluster. They raised their voices without consequence, hurled insults without reprimand, and turned committee hearings into partisan battlegrounds. They were rarely fined, rarely censured, rarely held accountable. In fact, their provocations were often rewarded with airtime, fundraising spikes, and glowing headlines in sympathetic outlets. Yet when Jasmine Crockett dared to match their energy without crossing into dishonesty, without breaking faith with her constituents, they decided she had gone too far. This was not a coincidence. It was a calculated move rooted in arrogance and fear. Arrogance because they believed the chamber belonged to them and their rules applied only when convenient. Fear because Crockett's presence unsettled the order they had carefully maintained. A young, unapologetic black woman rising in visibility was a direct challenge to their dominance. Her voice carried with it the authority of lived experience, not manufactured outrage. And that, to them, was intolerable. Look back and the pattern becomes unmistakable. Male colleagues had shouted across the room, questioning the intelligence of their opponents. Others had stormed out of hearings in dramatic protest, violating every standard of conduct they now claimed to defend. Some had even spread baseless conspiracy theories under the dome of Congress lies that carried real consequences for the nation. Yet where were the fines then? Where was the heavy hand of discipline when others turned the chamber into a circus? Silence, shrugs, excuses. But when Jasmine Crockett raised her voice not in rage but in defense of truth, they rushed to the rulebook, desperate to draw blood. The hypocrisy was not subtle. It was glaring, broadcast for the entire country to witness. And the double standard spoke louder than any insult ever could. This arrogance had a long history. These same forces had worked to silence opposition voices for decades. From blocking progressive bills with procedural tricks to marginalizing members who didn't fit their mold, they thrived on exclusion. They believed politics was their stage and dissenters were merely hecklers to be escorted out. But what they underestimated was how much the country had changed, and how quickly social media could expose the contradictions they tried to hide. In Crockett's case, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Clips circulated showing others behaving far worse without consequence. Commentators replayed footage of men pounding fists on desks, of lawmakers shouting personal insults, of blatant breaches of decorum, all left unpunished. Side by side with Crockett's composed, articulate remarks, the comparison was devastating. The establishment's narrative unraveled before their eyes. And this is where the seeds of downfall were planted. Because in attempting to silence her, they had overreached. Their arrogance blinded them to the optics, to the ripple effects, to the fact that the very tool they chose, a punitive fine, would become the clearest evidence of their double standard. What they framed as discipline looked, to the public, like discrimination. What they called order looked, to viewers, like intimidation. The irony could not be sharper. By punishing her, they hoped to showcase their power. Instead, they showcased their fear. By trying to diminish her, they only magnified her stature. And by enforcing rules selectively, they revealed that their authority rested not on fairness but on favoritism. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was a setup for their own embarrassment. To understand the power of Jasmine Crockett's defiance, you have to first understand where she came from. Hers is not the story of privilege or preordained success. It is the story of grit, of determination, of someone who carved her place in the world through relentless resilience. Before she walked into Congress, she walked the cracked sidewalks of her childhood neighborhood, where the lessons of struggle were etched into daily life. Born into a working-class family, Crockett learned early the value of perseverance. Her parents taught her that dignity was not something handed to you. It was something you protected, even when circumstances tried to strip it away. She saw firsthand how ordinary families bore the brunt of broken systems, how voices on the margins were ignored until someone demanded to be heard. That reality shaped her. It wasn't politics as a career she sought, it was justice as a calling. She excelled in school, not because the path was easy, but because she refused to let anyone convince her she didn't belong. Teachers underestimated her. Classmates doubted her. The subtle, ever-present message was clear: stay in your lane. But Crockett had no intention of staying in any lane built to keep her small. Every time someone told her no, she found a way to turn it into a yes. Her journey carried her into law, where she stood face to face with the injustices others preferred to ignore. She became a defense attorney, often representing those who couldn't afford high-powered counsel, the people the system would rather forget. In cramped courtrooms, she became the voice for those who had none. And with every case, she developed the tenacity and composure that would one day define her in politics. She wasn't loud for the sake of being loud. She was precise, strategic, unyielding, a force shaped not by entitlement, but by necessity. When she transitioned into public service, the same traits followed her. She didn't run for office to climb a ladder. She ran because she knew too many lives were being trampled by indifference. In the state legislature, she quickly gained a reputation as fearless. She took on fights others avoided, calling out hypocrisy, exposing inequities, refusing to water down her convictions for the sake of convenience. She carried herself with authenticity, the kind that can't be faked, the kind that comes from living the reality you speak about. By the time she entered Congress, she was already battle-tested. But here, on the national stage, the scrutiny intensified. She wasn't just a lawmaker now, she was a symbol of progress for some and a threat to the old order for others. The whispers grew louder: too bold, too brash, too young to know her place. These weren't critiques of her arguments. They were coded attempts to remind her of the lane she was supposed to stay in. But Jasmine Crockett had been underestimated her whole life, and every time she proved them wrong. When colleagues thought she would fade into the background, she rose to the microphone. When critics dismissed her as a passing figure, she made headlines that couldn't be ignored. And when opponents tried to punish her with a $15,000 fine, they miscalculated. They thought her story would end with retreat. They forgot that every setback in her life had only fueled her drive. Her rise wasn't about personal ambition, it was about representation. She carried the stories of those who looked like her, who shared her background, who had been told no by a world that stacked the deck against them. Each time she stood her ground in Congress, It wasn't just her voice echoing through the chamber, it was the echo of millions who had been silenced for too long. That authenticity is what made her dangerous to her opponents. They could mock her style, they could fine her paycheck, but they could never replicate the lived truth behind her words. Her journey is what made this confrontation so symbolic. To those who wanted to minimize her, the fine was the endgame. To Crockett, it was just another chapter in a lifelong story of resilience. She had been here before, in different forms, in different battles. Always underestimated, always pushed aside, always told to sit quietly. And always without fail. She turned that dismissal into fuel. And this time would be no different. Chamber was already charged when Jasmine Crockett rose to speak. You could feel it in the restless shifting of seats, the low murmur of voices pretending to be casual but edged with anticipation. Her opponents knew what was coming. They had watched her dismantle arguments before, not with wild shouting, but with surgical precision. And they were ready to cut her off at the first opportunity. It started predictably. The moment she began to outline her case, a voice from across the room interrupted, louder, harsher, meant to dominate. Another chimed in soon after, layering over her words until her sentences fought for air. It was a tactic as old as politics itself. Drown out the truth by flooding the room with noise. But Crockett did not flinch. She waited, calmly, her eyes fixed forward. And when the interruptions ebbed, she stepped back into her rhythm without missing a beat. Her composure rattled them more than any raised voice ever could. She didn't take the bait. She didn't mirror their hostility. Instead, she countered with crisp facts delivered like arrows. One by one, she turned their dismissals into opportunities, exposing contradictions with a poise that made the chamber lean closer. Each point she made seemed to pull the oxygen out of her opponent's theatrics. The escalation grew desperate. They began to talk over her again, louder this time, a chorus of deflection. But Crockett stood steady, her voice clear, unwavering. Every interruption only sharpened her focus. And when she finally delivered a pointed rebuttal, calm, measured, devastating, the room reacted in waves. Some gasped. Some smirked nervously. And others, those who had long felt silence, sat taller in their chairs, emboldened by the sight of someone refusing to yield. The atmosphere shifted. What began as a battle of volume turned into a battle of credibility, and the advantage was no longer theirs. The villains, so used to controlling the stage, looked suddenly unsettled, their attempts at dominance sliding into pettiness. Crockett, on the other hand, appeared untouchable, every counterpunch landing without breaking her composure. Then came the pause. A silence heavy with tension. It was the kind of silence that signals something irreversible is about to happen. The chamber held its breath, waiting to see what line would be crossed next. And that was when the announcement came, the fine, swift and staggering, handed down like a gavel meant to end the exchange once and for all. But then came the fine. And the entire game changed. The fine was meant to end it. A crushing figure, $15,000 slapped down with the weight of authority, as if money alone could muzzle conviction. The chamber stirred. Some leaned back, smug at what they thought was victory. Others whispered in disbelief, trying to process the audacity. For a moment, the villains thought they had silenced her. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't rise in outrage, didn't lash out with anger. That's what they wanted. Instead, she stood still, her presence gathering the room's attention like a storm on the horizon. Silence. A silence so deliberate it became louder than any interruption thrown her way. Her pause was not weakness, it was strategy. It forced every eye back on her. It made even her detractors shift uncomfortably, as if they already knew they had underestimated her once again. Then she spoke. Not fast, not furious, but with the clarity of someone who has chosen every word as if it were carved in stone. $15,000, she began, letting the number hang in the air. The words echoed in the chamber. A figure that was supposed to represent punishment now transformed into a symbol of resistance. That, she continued, her voice steady and sharp, is the price they thought would buy my silence. The room stilled. Gasps rippled, hushed but undeniable. Her opponents fidgeted in their seats. The camera lenses zoomed tighter, capturing the precision in her gaze. She didn't just counterattack, she dismantled. Point by point, she began to peel apart the flimsy scaffolding of the fine. She called out the double standards, calmly noting how others had shouted, insulted, even demeaned colleagues without consequence. She recited examples like receipts, each one cutting deeper into the credibility of those who claimed to enforce fairness. One villain shifted forward, attempting to interrupt, but Crockett raised a hand not in anger, but in control. The interruption faltered. She held the chamber in her grip, her authority undeniable. Her cadence sharpened. Every pause was intentional, letting her argument sink in, letting the injustice reveal itself not through volume but through logic, timing, and truth. She reminded them that this fine was not about order, it was about fear. Fear of a woman who would not bow. Fear of a black congresswoman who dared to speak with uncheckable confidence. Fear of what her voice represented, the millions outside those walls who had been silenced for too long. Her words echoed beyond the chamber. On social media, clips began to spread like wildfire. Hashtags ignited. Hashtag stand with Jasmine. Hashtag silence costs more. Hashtag mic drop moment. The world outside was watching in real time, amplifying her defiance. Commentators clipped her lines side by side with footage of her opponents fumbling, talking over her, resorting to pettiness. The contrast was devastating. Where they looked desperate, she looked disciplined. Where they flailed, she stood tall. TikTok edits layered her calm words over dramatic music, millions of views piling in hours. Twitter threads dissected her precision, line by line, as if analyzing the strategy of a masterclass debate. Back inside the chamber, the weight shifted. The villains had walked in confident, cloaked in authority. Now their faces betrayed unease. They had hoped to humiliate her. Instead, they had handed her a national platform. And Jasmine Crockett knew it. She leaned into the microphone, her tone sharpened but still restrained, like the final movement of a symphony about to reach its crescendo. "You thought," she said, locking eyes with her accusers, "that $15,000 could silence me. That I would bow my head, shrink my voice, and accept your double standards." She paused again, scanning the chamber as if daring anyone to deny the truth in her words. But what you bought wasn't silence. The air grew electric. Some in the gallery leaned forward. Others held their breath, sensing the moment they would replay again and again. Crockett's gaze didn't waver, her voice firm and unshakable as she delivered the final blow. "What you bought," she declared, "was a microphone." The words detonated through the chamber. Gasps, applause, even cheers erupted in pockets despite attempts to quiet the reaction. Social feeds exploded instantly. Clips of her mic drop line were stitched, remixed, amplified across every platform. Her opponents had underestimated her composure, her clarity, her ability to transform punishment into power. What was meant as her silencing had become her spotlight dot, and in that moment, the fine no longer mattered. The chamber was hers. The narrative was hers. The people's voices, long dismissed, were hers to carry. The villains had written the script for her downfall, but Crockett had flipped the ending. She turned their weapon into her platform, their fine into her microphone dot, and the world was listening. The chamber may have quieted, but outside those walls, Jasmine Crockett's words were only just beginning their journey. The moment her final line, "What you bought was a microphone," hit the airwaves, It detonated across social media like a lightning strike splitting the sky. Within minutes, hashtags blazed at the top of trending lists. Hashtag mic drop moment. Hashtag stand with Jasmine and hashtag 15KFOR freedom. Twitter feeds flooded with clips of her steady composure, each replay amplifying the sting against her opponents. On TikTok, creators layered her words over cinematic music, slow-motion edits of her steady stare, captions flashing like neon signs. Power cannot be fined into silence. Young activists stitched her speech with their own testimony stories of being talked over, dismissed, told to wait their turn. Suddenly, her defense was no longer just about her. It became a vessel for thousands of voices who had lived that very silencing. Instagram was no quieter. Memes turned the $15,000 fine into a badge of honor. One viral image showed Crockett standing tall with the caption, "Receipts, $15,000, change, priceless." Another featured her quote branded across protest posters, "Silence isn't for sale." The reach was staggering. By nightfall, her speech had been viewed millions of times, dissected in threads, and turned into rallying cries by organizers across the country. Cable news scrambled to keep up. Pundits who once dismissed her as too fiery were forced to acknowledge her poise. One commentator on a major network called it a masterclass in restraint and power. Another admitted, grudgingly, that her accusers had handed her a national spotlight on a silver platter. Even usually hostile, outlets struggled to spin the moment because the footage spoke louder than spin. The raw clarity of her mic drop had pierced through the noise. Then came the celebrity wave. Influential actors, musicians, and athletes reposted her clip, often adding their own words of admiration. A Grammy-winning artist wrote, "This is how you speak truth to power." A famous NBA star tweeted, $15,000 can't silence the real ones. Respect to Jasmine Crockett. Activists seized the moment, organizing digital fundraisers to cover the fine in symbolic solidarity. Within hours, not only was the fine fully raised, but donations poured far beyond the mark, turning punishment into a movement. Meanwhile, the villains reeled. Their strategy had collapsed under the weight of public opinion. Where they thought the fine would humble her, it instead magnified her voice. Leaked reports suggested frantic phone calls, hurried meetings, aides whispering damage control strategies. But the more they tried to dismiss the uproar, the more foolish they looked. Their silence, once a tool of dominance, now seemed like cowardice. Jasmine Crockett, however, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her stature was growing in real time, not as a politician merely defending herself, but as a symbol of something larger, the resilience of those who refused to be erased. She had tapped into a current that surged far beyond her own seat in Congress. Commentators began to speculate aloud. Was this the moment she went from freshman lawmaker to national figure? Was this the kind of moment that redefined political careers? And yet, as the headlines multiplied, as the hashtag spread, as the villains scrambled to rewrite their misstep, one truth became increasingly clear. This wasn't the end of the story. Because while Jasmine Crockett's rise seemed unstoppable, the forces that opposed her weren't done scheming. The world had witnessed the explosion. But the most powerful twist was yet to come. In the days that followed, as the hashtags cooled and the media cycle shifted, Jasmine Crockett herself brought the focus back to where it belonged. She reminded the country that this moment was never just about her. The $15,000 fine was meant to muzzle, to intimidate, to send a message that passion, especially when spoken by a black woman in a position of power, would be punished. But Crockett reframed it with clarity. "Every attempt to silence me," she said, "only amplifies the truth I stand for." That was the moral heartbeat of her counterattack. Suppression doesn't smother the flame, it spreads the fire. The arrogance of those who believed they could purchase her silence only ended up giving her message wings. And the nation watching began to understand that the fine wasn't just a penalty. It was proof of what she had been fighting against all along, a system that tries to shut down voices instead of listening to them. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, you had the villains of this saga, arrogant, dismissive, caught in their own double standards, wielding rules like weapons. On the other, you had Crockett, calm, resilient, rooted in dignity. She didn't match insult with insult or anger with rage. Instead, she proved something timeless, that truth spoken with composure carries more power than intimidation shouted from a podium. Story connected to a long line of history. Every era has seen figures who faced efforts to silence them: activists, reformers, ordinary citizens who stood up to injustice. And every era proves the same lesson. When the righteous are pressed down, they don't disappear. They rise stronger, clearer, louder. From suffragists jailed for demanding the vote to civil rights leaders facing arrests and violence, history repeats one pattern again and again. Arrogance may punish, but it cannot prevail. Dignity endures. Crockett herself embodied that lineage. She wasn't just defending herself in that chamber. She was carrying forward the struggle of all who had been told their voices were too loud, too sharp, too disruptive. By refusing to shrink, she reminded the nation that democracy depends not on the comfort of the powerful, but on the courage of the unheard. The moral was undeniable. Intimidation may win headlines, but dignity wins history. And Crockett's calm defiance turned what could have been a moment of humiliation into a moment of inspiration for millions. As one supporter wrote online, "They gave her a fine. She gave us a future." And so, the story wasn't about $15,000 at all. It was about something priceless, the unshakable truth that the voice of the people cannot be bought, silenced, or erased. But even as that truth settled in, one question lingered over the political landscape, stirring curiosity and anticipation. If this was the fire she sparked under pressure, what would Jasmine Crockett do next? They tried to silence Jasmine Crockett with $15,000. They thought the weight of a fine could crush her spirit, could muzzle her fire. But instead, it backfired in the most spectacular way possible, turning her into the loudest, clearest voice in America's political arena. What was meant to be punishment became power. What was meant to be humiliation became history. And here's the truth. This story isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. It's about all of us. Because every time someone in power tries to drown out a voice, it is our collective duty to amplify it louder. Dignity, justice, equality, those are not luxuries. They are birthrights. And when one person stands unshaken, we are all reminded that arrogance may bully for a season, but truth echoes for generations. So if you felt that spark while watching this unfold, don't let it end here. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because the louder we get together, the harder it becomes to silence any of us. And if you believe in voices like Jasmine Crockett's, voices that refuse to be bought, bullied, or buried, then join this movement. Subscribe to this channel, drop a comment with your own story of standing up, and become part of this growing wave of people who